Today, I would like to tell you all something about the life of one man, Kune Sugihara, whose life spanned almost the entire 20th century. And I want to tell this story partly because today is International Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's important to recover stories from that time that are at risk of being forgotten. And I want to tell it partly because our worship theme this month is altruism, and I believe this story is a memorable example. I admit it feels a little odd to be telling a heroic story that centers a non-Jew when there are so many acts of Jewish heroism, risk, and self-sacrifice from these years to tell. So let me say I partly want to tell this story because it contains lessons for those in positions of privilege or power. But mostly, I want to tell this story because it is profoundly human and profoundly worthy of being told. Kune Sugihara was born in Russia to Japanese parents in the year 1900, and by his mid-30s, he was working as a mid-level bureaucrat in Japan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In the 1930s, as violence in Europe escalated, he was sent as Japan's first ambassador to Lithuania, a small nation that had been recently claimed by the Soviet Union. There, Kune Sugihara worked as a diplomat and reported to Japan on the movement and plans of both Germany and the USSR. And this is all taking place before Japan and Germany are allied, and the World War is not yet called that. As German troops advance closer to Lithuania's borders, all the foreign consulates, including Japan's, are told to close their doors and evacuate as soon as possible. Sugihara plans to obey, but on the morning of July 7th, 1940, he wakes up to find a huge crowd gathered outside the embassy. Dozens, maybe hundreds of people are pressed against the iron gate of the consulate office, patiently waiting for an audience with the ambassador. Who are these people? Why are they here? Sugihara doesn't know it at the time, but they are all Jewish refugees, desperate to escape the country before the Nazi forces arrive. They can't leave Lithuania without the right papers, which means they need to find a nation willing to allow them entry and willing to provide the visas that will let them travel. And their desperation has brought them to the doors of Japan's embassy here in Lithuania's capital. One refugee who lined up outside Sugihara's door that day recalled after the war, "We all felt desperate to get somewhere, which was impossible because no one wanted Jews." With all the consulates closing their doors, the situation is extremely dire. The refugees know that if they can just receive permission to travel to Japan, they'll be able to flee eastward through the USSR and have a chance to figure out a more permanent destination along the way. They just need someone to sign their visas. Sugihara begins to meet with the people who are gathered outside his door and finds that very few of them have the documents required for him to sign legal visas. And a suspicious number claim to be planning to travel through Japan and on to Curacao, a tiny Caribbean island controlled by the Dutch. Curacao, it turns out, is one of the only destinations in the world that doesn't require an entry visa. Here, Sugihara faces a choice. Rules exist for a reason. They keep us safe, keep the world orderly, and it is his job to follow them. After all, if people are allowed to move freely between countries, what's to stop criminals or disease from moving with them? As ambassador, it is his sworn duty to discern carefully between those who are worthy of permission to travel and those who are not. Sugihara writes to his bosses in Tokyo to ask what he should do. And this is the moment when it becomes clear why this is a story worth telling, why this is a life worth remembering. Because without waiting to hear back from Tokyo, Sugihara starts writing visas. He lets the Lithuanian government know he will be extending his consulate stay by 1 month and opens his door to the throngs of hopeful refugees gathered outside. When asked later about this moment, Sugihara says, "You want to know about my motivation, don't you? Well, It's the kind of sentiments anyone would have when he actually sees refugees face to face, begging with tears in their eyes. You just cannot help but sympathize with them. They were so desperate that they went so far as to kiss my shoes. Yes, I actually witnessed such scenes with my own eyes. So I made up my mind not to wait for the reply. In this passage, he seems almost personally offended that people should be forced into such desperation that they would kiss his feet. He says repeatedly that merely witnessing this, simply being face to face with human beings in such need, is enough to make his course of action obvious. Each visa requires detailed information and pages of elaborate Japanese calligraphy. Sugihara and his wife, Yukiko, both work on them, writing for 10 to 14 hours at a time, day in and day out. On July 28th, after issuing 2 weeks' worth of visas to Jewish refugees, Sugihara receives the following telegram from Tokyo. Concerning transit visas requested previously, advise absolutely not to be issued any traveler not holding firm end visa with guaranteed departure from Japan. No exceptions, no further inquiries expected. This means travelers must have proof of a planned destination other than Japan and must prove they have enough money to travel and to not be a burden on any nation that accepts them. In other words, it's 1940, and only those who are wealthy and well-connected are allowed to leave Europe. In Sugihara's words, I knew that if I were to obey the ministry and not issue the Japan transit visas to the refugees, it would be considered following orders, and I would not be criticized. Any diplomat in my situation would likely have chosen to follow orders and refuse to issue the visas. After all, every diplomat is worried about not being promoted or being dismissed due to legal violations. That is why, quite honestly, when I received the response, I thought about it all night. After all, everyone is worried about not being promoted, about breaking the law, losing the career you've worked so hard to build, putting your family at risk. It can be very easy for us to look back at the atrocities of human history from a safe distance and imagine ourselves into altruistic roles. Easy to see great acts of civil disobedience and remember the civil more than we remember the disobedient. But altruism so often calls for us to risk the things we most take for granted. Our safety, our routine, the structures we are a part of without thinking, and all for the sake of people we don't even know. One indelible lesson of the Holocaust is how effortlessly some will follow orders to monstrous ends. And here, Sugihara has received his orders. Stop issuing visas to refugees. And he understands that if he follows them, no one in his society will hold it against him. And yet he disobeys. After his long night considering the telegraph, Sugihara redoubles his visa-writing efforts and no longer even requires the half-fudged destination of Curacao. Anyone who comes into his office leaves with a visa that will allow them to escape Lithuania. The more visas he signs, the more the crowd outside the consulate grows, and the word spreads that this is a potential escape route. Susan Blumen, the refugee from earlier who said that no nation wanted Jews, was fleeing Poland with her fiancé with no entry visa for any destination. And Susan doesn't even have a passport at this point. But Sugihara fills out her travel visa without so much as asking for an explanation of the missing documents. Eventually, Sugihara's hands cramp and he can't keep up. He begins signing and stamping mostly blank visas, letting people fill in their own details, no questions asked. In Sugihara's words, "These people told me the kind of horror they would have to face if they didn't get away from the Nazis, and I believed them. There was no place else for them to go. They trusted me. If I had waited any longer, even if permission came, it might have been too late. They told me the kind of horror they'd have to face if they didn't get away, and I believed them," he says. I believed them. So simple, yet this is a reckless miracle of human trust. At this time, the Jews of Europe are crying out for the world to see what is happening and being met with skepticism and indifference everywhere, including here in the United States. Nations all over the world are claiming to be cautious, choosing to protect their own perceived safety and integrity rather than get involved. It can't really be as bad as they claim, they justify, but it was, and it was worse. And Sugihara, whose very job as a diplomat is to be skeptical and cautious and discerning, throws that all into the wind and simply believes the refugees at his door. Nobody would flee in such desperation unless they had to. No one would weep and kiss the shoes of a stranger without truly fearing for their lives and the lives of their children. And in believing them, he knew he had to help them. At the end of August 1940, the consulate is finally shut down, and Sugihara and his family are put on a train leaving Lithuania. The crowd of refugees follows him to the train station, and he continues to sign blank visas and throw them into the crowd. Finally, as the train pulls out of the station, he throws the official consulate stationery out onto the crowded platform in the hope that it can be used to possibly save more lives. And with that final act of reckless conviction, he's gone. Just days later, Japan signs the Tripartite Pact, allying itself with Germany, and soon after, Nazi forces arrive in Lithuania and begin mass executions of Jewish citizens. Sugihara, in that final month in Lithuania, wrote 2,139 visas for both individuals and whole families, saving an estimated 6,000 lives. One family group of 30 people all escaped east on a single visa under the name Jakob Goldberg. The Mir Yeshiva, an academy of Orthodox scholars, got all 300 students out on visas signed by Sugihara. And theirs was the only European yeshiva to survive. On this International Holocaust Remembrance Day, we remember, but what do we remember? We remember 6 million lives lost, and we remember 6,000 lives saved. They do not counterbalance each other, because each life is infinitely worthy. Each life deserves to be remembered. And today, we remember the life of one man who gave what was in his power to give and set no conditions, who had nothing to gain except the vindication of his own humanity, and who saved thousands of lives from behind a desk. To quote the man himself, "I knew that somebody would surely complain about me in the future, but I myself thought this would be the right thing to do. There's nothing wrong in saving many people's lives. The spirit of humanity, with this spirit, I ventured to do what I did." After leaving Lithuania, Sugihara and his family spent over a year in a Soviet prisoner of war camp, and when they finally returned to Japan after the war, Kune Sugihara was promptly fired from his position with the foreign ministry. In the decades of recovery following World War II, Sugihara lived a quiet life working odd jobs, including as a light bulb salesman, a dock porter, and an office manager. He never spoke about his year in Lithuania. In 1968, a man named Joshua Nishri tracked him down in his hometown and asked to meet in person. Mr. Nishri was working as an aide to the Israeli embassy in Tokyo, and when he met with Sugihara, he told him a familiar story. Told him the story of fleeing Lithuania all those years ago, and showed the visa Sugihara himself had signed. With tears in both their eyes, Nishri thanked Sugihara for saving his life. More than 20 years after the war, he was the first surviving refugee Sugihara had met. In 1985, the nation of Israel officially honored Kune Sugihara as righteous among the nations, though he was too ill to travel to receive the award. And in 1986, Kune Sugihara died, survived by his wife and 3 of his children. When he died, his friends and neighbors in Japan knew nothing of his remarkable past, and it was only when a large international Jewish delegation showed up at his funeral that his wartime deeds became common knowledge. And in 1991, a park was built in his honor in his hometown called Hill of Humanity Park. Among the sources we claim as Unitarian Universalists are the words and deeds of prophetic people from history. And the prophetic people we lean most toward remembering are those who gave great speeches or who gathered movements around them, charismatic leaders and talented writers. A little less common is someone like this, like Kune Sugihara, a prophetic bureaucrat, an unassuming man who saw people in pain and did what was in his power to help. Last month, there were volunteers in the desert arrested for leaving jugs of water at the Mexican border. When the Muslim ban first went into effect, there were lawyers who lined up at airports offering pro bono assistance. There were clerks who signed marriage licenses for gay couples before it was legal. Just this fall, a church held a 6-week-long mass service to protect a family seeking asylum, with 650 clergy volunteering to keep the service going 24 hours a day. None of these acts resolve any greater struggle, just as 6,000 lives saved does not undo the millions lost. But every life is worth remembering and fighting for, and resignation to hopelessness doesn't save anyone. Volunteers in this very congregation are showing up to stand guard at our partner sanctuary church, protecting a family that doesn't have the right documents to prove to the government they deserve to be here. So what does it look like to not concern ourselves with who deserves to be anywhere, who deserves to receive what we give? What does it look like to throw visas from the train window, to believe without condition that strangers are worthy of our help and our humanity? When Kune Sugihara tried to explain what made him act as he did, he said simply, "The spirit of humanity. With this spirit, I ventured to do what I did. Do what is right because it is right." May we all carry the same spirit of humanity into even the most dehumanizing systems. And may we all venture to do what we can because we can. Do what is right because it is right. And remember the story of a good man. Amen.